I had always been an avid camper, finding solace in the embrace of nature, away from the clamor of city life. The dense forests of northern Pakistan, with their towering pines and serene landscapes, had always beckoned me. So, one summer, I decided to embark on a solo camping trip to the Kagan Valley, a place renowned for its untouched beauty and tranquility. I meticulously planned my journey, ensuring I had all the necessary gear: a sturdy tent, ample food supplies, a reliable map, and a satellite phone for emergencies. Friends and family expressed concern about my solo venture, but I assured them of my preparedness and experience. The thrill of solitude in the wilderness was something I had always cherished, and this trip was meant to be a retreat from the incessant demands of daily life. The drive to Kagan Valley was picturesque, with winding roads flanked by lush greenery and the melodious chirping of birds. I arrived at the trailhead by noon, parked my vehicle, and hoisted my backpack, ready to immerse myself in nature's embrace. The trail was moderately challenging, with occasional clearings that offered breathtaking views of snow-capped peaks in the distance. After hiking for about 5 hours, I reached a secluded spot near a gently flowing stream, an ideal location to set up camp. The area was flat, surrounded by dense foliage, and the soothing sound of water added to the ambience. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and prepared a simple meal as the sun began its descent, casting a golden hue over the landscape. As night enveloped the valley, the temperature dropped, and I nestled into my sleeping bag, the gentle crackling of the campfire providing comfort. The canopy above was a tapestry of stars, and the serenity was profound. I drifted into sleep, lulled by the harmonious symphony of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a rustling sound outside my tent. My heart raced as I strained to listen, every nerve on edge. The sound was intermittent, like footsteps cautiously approaching. I reminded myself that it could be a small animal foraging, common in these woods. Taking a deep breath, I slowly unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated the dense underbrush, revealing nothing unusual. I scanned the area meticulously but found no signs of movement. Convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks, I retreated into the tent, secured the zipper, and tried to calm my racing mind. Morning arrived with the gentle warmth of the sun filtering through the trees. The events of the night seemed distant, almost trivial, in the light of day. I decided to explore the vicinity, leaving markers to ensure I could find my way back. The forest was enchanting, with beams of sunlight piercing through the canopy, illuminating patches of vibrant wildflowers. I came across a serene lake, its surface reflecting the azure sky, and spent hours basking in the tranquility. Returning to camp in the late afternoon, I noticed something peculiar. The firewood I had gathered was scattered, and the remnants of the fire seemed disturbed. A sense of unease washed over me. I rationalized that perhaps a curious animal had wandered into the campsite during my absence. Determined not to let paranoia ruin my retreat, I reorganized the camp, prepared dinner, and as dusk settled, I fortified the area by creating a perimeter with a makeshift alarm using empty cans and string. That night, sleep was elusive. Every rustle, every whisper of the wind seemed amplified. Around midnight, the clinking of cans jolted me upright. Someone or something had triggered the alarm. My pulse quickened as I grabbed the flashlight and a sturdy stick, my only means of defense. Emerging cautiously from the tent, I directed the light towards the source of the disturbance. The beam caught a fleeting glimpse of movement, a shadow disappearing into the thicket. Adrenaline surged through me as I called out, demanding to know who was there, but only silence responded. The realization that I might not be alone, that perhaps someone was deliberately lurking, sent chills down my spine. I spent the remainder of the night on high alert, the stick clutched tightly in my hands, the flashlight illuminating the tent's entrance. At the break of dawn, fatigue weighed heavily on me, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The sense of being watched, the disturbances, they were signs I couldn't ignore. I decided to pack up and head back to civilization. As I dismantled the tent, I noticed footprints around the campsite. Not animal tracks, but human. The prints were erratic, suggesting someone had been circling the area. A knot formed in my stomach as I hastened my pace, packing up and ensuring nothing was left behind. The hike back was arduous, not due to the terrain, but because of the constant feeling of being followed. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me glancing over my shoulder. I maintained a brisk pace, driven by an instinctual urge to put distance between myself and whatever or whoever was out there. Reaching the trailhead, I was relieved to see my vehicle untouched. I loaded my gear, took one last look at the forest, and couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were observing my departure. The drive back was a blur, my mind replaying the events, searching for explanations. Once home, I reported the incident to the local authorities, providing them with details and the location. They acknowledged my concerns but mentioned that such I had always loved camping alone. There was something about being out in the wild, away from people, away from noise. Just me, my tent, the trees, and the open sky. I had done it so many times before that I never felt nervous about it. I knew how to set up camp, how to store food properly, and how to keep myself safe. But this trip was different. Something about it felt off from the very beginning, though I couldn't say exactly why. I picked a remote spot in a national forest, miles from the nearest road. It was early autumn, the air cool but not freezing. Perfect weather for sleeping outside. The area was dense with trees, and I found a clearing next to a small stream. Seemed ideal. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for the evening. As the sun set, the forest grew eerily silent. Usually, I would hear the sounds of insects, distant owls, or rustling in the underbrush. But this time, there was nothing. Just an unsettling quiet that pressed in on me. I tried to shake off the feeling. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I built a small fire and cooked my dinner. As I ate, I kept glancing into the dark trees. I had that strange feeling you get when someone is watching you. But of course, there was no one there. Just darkness stretching out in every direction. I finished eating and cleaned up, making sure not to leave any scraps that could attract animals. Then, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound made me jolt awake. I kept thinking I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. But when I held my breath and listened, there was nothing, just that awful, pressing silence. Morning came and I felt exhausted, but I told myself it was just paranoia. I had been alone in the woods plenty of times before, and nothing bad had ever happened. I wasn't about to let my nerves ruin this trip. So, I shook it off, made some coffee, and decided to explore the area. I hiked a few miles through the trees, following the stream. I found animal tracks, mostly deer and small critters. Nothing unusual. But then, I came across something strange. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked in a clearing. They looked deliberate, like someone had placed them there with care. I bent down and examined them. There was nothing obviously weird about them, but something about them unsettled me. Felt like a marker, like a sign meant for someone. Or maybe a warning. I stood up and looked around. The trees were dense, and I couldn't see very far. But I suddenly felt exposed, like I had wandered into a place I wasn't supposed to be. I turned and hurried back to my campsite, trying not to let my imagination get the best of me. By the time I reached my tent, the sky was already darkening. The short autumn days had a way of sneaking up on me. I built another fire and forced myself to relax. But I kept thinking about those stacked rocks. Who had put them there? Why? The forest was supposed to be empty. There were no marked trails nearby, no signs of other campers. The nearest road was miles away. So who had been out there? As I sat by the fire, I heard something, a rustling sound deeper in the woods. It wasn't the wind. It was steady, rhythmic, footsteps, slow and deliberate, just like the ones I thought I had heard the night before. I tensed up and stared into the trees, but the firelight only reached so far. Beyond it, everything was just shifting shadows. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but I didn't believe it. I stayed up later than I should have, listening, but the footsteps never came closer. They just stayed out there, beyond my sight, pacing. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent walls, waiting. But nothing happened. The sounds stopped, and at some point, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and froze. Something was different. Took me a moment to realize what it was. The rocks, the stacked rocks. They were now right outside my tent. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. Someone had been here. Someone had walked right up to my campsite while I was sleeping. Someone had placed those rocks there. I looked around, heart pounding. The forest was still and silent, as if it were holding its breath. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I needed to leave. I had never felt fear like that before. I had camped alone dozens of times, but I had never felt hunted. I started back toward the road, moving fast. Too fast. I wasn't careful about my footing, and at one point, I slipped on a patch of loose dirt and went sprawling down a small embankment. My knee hit something hard, and pain shot up my leg. I bit down on a curse and forced myself up. My pants were torn, my knee scraped and bleeding, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. As I limped forward, I felt it again, that awful, creeping sensation of being watched. I turned and looked behind me, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing between the trees, too far to make out details, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. Just standing there, watching me. I didn't stop to think. I ran. My knee screamed in pain, but I didn't care. I ran faster than I ever had in my life. Branches whipped at my arms and face, but I didn't slow down. I could hear movement behind me, someone crashing through the underbrush, chasing me. I burst out of the trees and onto the narrow dirt road where my car was parked. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so hard I could barely grip them. I threw open the door, jumped inside, and slammed the locks shut. My chest was heaving, my heart hammering. I stared out the windshield, expecting to see that figure emerge from the trees. But nothing moved, just stillness, just silence. I didn't waste another second. I started the engine and tore down the road, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back to that forest. I never camped alone again. I planned the trip alone. I always liked the idea of being by myself in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees, the sound of birds, and the rustling of leaves. It felt like the best way to get away from everything. No phone calls, no emails, no people. Just quiet. I drove upstate for hours, past small towns and long stretches of empty road, until I reached the entrance to the national forest. The place wasn't exactly popular, which was part of the appeal. Fewer people meant fewer distractions. I pulled my truck into a clearing near the trailhead, checked my supplies, and made sure I had everything before locking up and setting off on foot. The hike to the campsite took a little over 2 hours. It was deep in the woods, far from any marked paths. I had researched the area thoroughly and found an old map online that showed a clearing near a small stream. That's where I was headed. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The silence was thick, broken only by my own footsteps and the occasional bird call. The air smelled damp, a mix of earth and pine, and every now and then, a branch snapped somewhere in the distance. I told myself it was just an animal. There were deer in the area, maybe a raccoon. I reached the clearing by late afternoon. It was perfect, flat ground, enough space for my tent, and the stream nearby for water. I set up camp, unrolled my sleeping bag inside the tent, and got a fire going before the sun dipped too low. I ate a simple meal, watched the sky darken, and listened to the sounds of the forest as I let the fire burn down to embers. By nightfall, the woods had become a different place. The stillness had an edge to it. I was used to the sounds of nature, but something about the quiet now felt unnatural. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just imagining things. I climbed into my tent, zipped up the flap, and lay down. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had gone out completely, and the tent was pitch black. I listened. There was nothing, no wind, no crickets, just silence. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving just outside my tent. My heart started pounding. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps stopped. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 10, 20, full minute. Then another step, closer this time. I reached for the knife I always kept in my sleeping bag. My fingers wrapped around the handle, gripping it so tight my hand ached. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps moved away. Slow at first, then fading into the distance. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, knife in hand, listening to every sound. By morning, the forest seemed normal again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, birds chirped, and everything felt like it had before. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a deer that wandered too close to the tent. But deep down, I knew better. I packed up quickly. The feeling in my gut told me to leave. As I folded my tent, I noticed something strange. The ground around my campsite was disturbed. Footprints. Not animal tracks, human ones. I followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into the underbrush. My stomach twisted. Someone had been watching me, maybe for hours, maybe longer. I grabbed my pack, made my way back to the trail, and hiked out faster than I ever had before. The whole time I felt eyes on me. I never saw anyone, but I knew they were there. I made it back to my truck just after noon, threw my gear in the back, and got in. As I turned the key, I glanced back toward the trees one last time. The woods looked the same as they had before, peaceful, quiet. But I knew better. I don't know exactly when it went from a simple camping trip to the worst night of my life. It crept up on me, slowly at first, like a shadow stretching long in the evening sun. I had no idea what was coming, no real warning signs until it was already too late. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I wanted to get away from everything, people, work, the endless noise of life. I chose a remote spot in the mountains, far enough from any trails or campsites that I wouldn't see another soul. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I packed everything carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a knife, a first aid kit. I had done solo trips before, and I knew how to be prepared. The drive took most of the day. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road winding up through thick forest. By the time I parked, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. I grabbed my gear and hiked in about 3 miles, far enough that I wouldn't have to worry about any unexpected visitors. The spot I picked was perfect. A small clearing, soft ground for the tent, a fallen log to sit on while I cooked. The forest around me was dense, the air crisp and cool. The only sounds were birds and the rustling of leaves. It was exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. As darkness settled in, I felt completely at peace. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks into the night. Above me, the sky was a deep, endless black, scattered with stars. I sat for a long time, just listening to the forest breathe around me. Then, at some point, I realized something had changed. It was subtle at first. The usual night sounds, crickets, the occasional owl had faded away. The silence pressed down, thick and heavy. It wasn't normal. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal nearby had startled them into quiet. Maybe I was imagining things. But then I heard it, a sound just beyond the fire's reach, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves underfoot. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I strained my ears, trying to hear more, but the silence swallowed everything. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight, my breath shallow. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. Something harmless. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I forced myself to relax, but I kept my knife close as I climbed into my tent. I left the fire burning low outside, hoping it would keep anything or anyone away. Sleep was slow to come. Every tiny noise set my nerves on edge, but exhaustion won out, and at some point I drifted off. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was instinct. But when I opened my eyes, I felt it immediately. Something was wrong. The fire was out. Complete darkness surrounded me, and then I heard it again, closer this time, that same deliberate crunch of leaves. Slow, steady. I held my breath. The sound stopped right outside my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears. My hand tightened around the knife. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to stay still, to be silent. Then something touched the fabric of my tent. A faint drag, like fingers running along the material. It moved from one side to the other, slow and deliberate. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I couldn't. I was trapped. If I unzipped the tent, I wouldn't know what I was stepping into. If I stayed, whatever was out there had all the control. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The night was silent again. I didn't move, couldn't. I stayed frozen, listening, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I slipped into a restless sleep, knife still in my hand. When I woke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the tent fabric. For a moment, I let myself believe I had imagined everything. Then I unzipped the tent. The fire pit was cold, but that wasn't what made my stomach turn. Footprints, clear human footprints, circled my campsite. They weren't mine. They led from the trees right up to my tent, stopping where I had heard the sound. Then they led away again, disappearing into the forest. Whoever it was had been watching me, waiting. I hadn't imagined it. I packed up fast. My hands shook as I stuffed my gear into my bag. Every minute I spent there felt like a mistake. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there, watching. The hike back to my car was the longest of my life. Every sound sent my heart racing. I didn't stop to rest, didn't look back. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors the second I got inside. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine and peeled out of there, dirt kicking up behind me. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I had always been an avid camper, relishing the serenity of the wilderness and the escape from the clamor of daily life. Over the years, I had ventured into various terrains, from dense forests to arid deserts, each trip offering its unique set of challenges and memories. This particular journey, however, would etch itself into my mind, not for the tranquility I sought, but for the harrowing ordeal that unfolded. It was late autumn when I decided to explore the remote stretches of the Pacific Northwest. The allure of towering pines, mist-laden mornings, and the promise of solitude beckoned me. I meticulously planned my route, ensuring I had all the necessary gear: a sturdy tent, ample provisions, a reliable map, and a GPS device. Friends and family were informed of my itinerary, a precaution I always took seriously. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the winding roads offering glimpses of the majestic landscape I was about to immerse myself in. Upon arrival, I hoisted my backpack, took a deep breath of the crisp air, and embarked on the trail. The forest enveloped me, its dense canopy filtering the sunlight into gentle beams that danced on the forest floor. After several hours of hiking, I reached a clearing beside a tranquil lake. The water's surface mirrored the fiery hues of the setting sun, creating a picturesque scene. I set up my tent near the shoreline, gathered some firewood, and soon had a small fire crackling. As darkness settled, the symphony of nocturnal creatures filled the air, lulling me into a sense of peace. The first night passed without incident. I awoke to the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant call of a loon. After a hearty breakfast, I spent the day exploring the surrounding area, noting the rich biodiversity and the untouched beauty of the wilderness. By late afternoon, I returned to my campsite, prepared my evening meal, and settled in for another quiet night. It was around midnight when I was jolted awake by a peculiar sound. At first, I couldn't discern its origin. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a wooden surface. I brushed it off as branches swaying in the wind or perhaps a woodpecker in the distance. However, the sound persisted, growing slightly louder and more deliberate. Curiosity piqued. I unzipped my tent and peered into the inky darkness. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a dim light around the campsite. I scanned the perimeter but saw nothing unusual, chalking it up to the myriad noises of the forest. I retreated into my tent and eventually drifted back to sleep. The following day was uneventful. I hiked to a nearby ridge, capturing panoramic views of the sprawling forest below. The vastness of the wilderness was both humbling and exhilarating. As dusk approached, I made my way back, prepared dinner, and settled by the fire with a book. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it was accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching softly on the forest floor. My heart rate quickened. I reminded myself that many animals are nocturnal, and it was likely a deer or some other creature foraging nearby. Yet, there was an unsettling rhythm to the steps, almost as if they were pacing. Gripping my flashlight, I mustered the courage to investigate. Emerging from my tent, I shone the beam in the direction of the noise. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual chorus of insects and frogs eerily silent. I saw nothing, no gleaming eyes reflecting the light, no movement among the trees. Unease settled over me, but I convinced myself it was my imagination playing tricks. I added more wood to the fire, hoping its warmth and light would ward off both the cold and my growing apprehension. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of shadowy figures lurking just beyond my vision. At dawn, I decided to stay close to the campsite, my enthusiasm for exploration dampened by the previous night's disturbances. I busied myself with small tasks, purifying water, reinforcing my tent, and whittling a piece of wood I had found. Despite the day's mundanity, An undercurrent of tension gnawed at me. As evening descended, a dense fog rolled in, shrouding the forest in a ghostly veil. The fire's glow barely penetrated the mist, creating an otherworldly ambience. I ate dinner in silence, every rustle and snap amplified in the obscured landscape. Retreating into my tent, I secured the flap tightly and lay down, straining to hear any anomalies. Sometime in the dead of night, I was roused by a new sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whispering. It was as if multiple voices murmured in unison, their words indistinguishable. Fear gripped me. I felt paralyzed, torn between the urge to confront the source and the instinct to remain hidden. Summoning every ounce of courage, I slowly reached for my flashlight and knife. Just as I was about to unzip the tent, a blinding light flooded the area. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The light was accompanied by the distant hum of engines. Relief washed over me as I realized it was a helicopter, likely a search and rescue team. I scrambled. I have always enjoyed camping. Something about being out in the wild, away from the constant hum of the city, always brought me a sense of peace. But that changed after a trip I took 2 years ago. I haven't gone back since. I tell myself it's because I got too busy with work, but deep down I know the real reason. It was mid-September when I packed my truck with my gear and drove out to a national forest about 4 hours from home. I had camped there before, but this time I wanted to go deeper into the woods, away from the designated sites where families parked their RVs. I wanted silence, true isolation. I found a spot by a small creek, about 2 miles off the main trail, and set up my tent just before the sun started to dip below the trees. The first night was peaceful. The cool air and the distant sound of running water made it easy to fall asleep. I woke up once in the middle of the night, hearing something moving outside, but it was probably just a deer. I had encountered plenty of wildlife on my trips before. I wasn't afraid of animals. I fell back asleep without much thought. The next day, I spent my time exploring the area, collecting firewood, and just taking in the quiet. I barely checked my phone, only using it to take a few pictures. The isolation felt good. I had no one to talk to, nothing to worry about. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of leaves as small animals moved through the undergrowth. As the sun started to set, I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat watching the flames until fatigue set in. That's when things started feeling off. As I was putting out the fire, I heard something in the distance. It was faint but unmistakable. A snapping twig, followed by a soft, slow crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I stood still, listening, waiting. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon, maybe a fox. But as I crawled into my tent, zipping myself inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That night, I woke up again. This time, it was different. I could hear something outside my tent. Not just the occasional rustling, but deliberate, slow movements. It wasn't circling, wasn't running off when I stirred. It was just standing there, listening. I reached for the knife I always kept next to me when I camped. My heart was pounding, my ears straining to pick up every sound. The footsteps moved closer, just outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. My breath caught in my throat as I heard a long, slow exhale. Human. I stayed frozen. My mind raced with thoughts. Who could be out here? Another camper? A lost hiker? But something in my gut told me that wasn't it. Whoever it was, they weren't making their presence known like a normal person would. No calling out, no flashlights. Just standing. Just breathing. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away, fading into the forest. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, gripping my knife, my ears straining for any sign of movement. When the sun rose, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my heart hammering. Nothing was disturbed. No footprints in the soft dirt. No sign that anyone had been there. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was some animal that just happened to sound human. I almost convinced myself of that. Almost. The third day, I decided to stay close to my campsite. I had planned to stay a full week, but the events of the night before left me uneasy. I told myself if anything else weird happened, I'd pack up and leave the next morning. I spent the day chopping wood, keeping the fire going even in daylight. The warmth and light made me feel safer. But then, as the sun was setting, I found something that made my blood run cold. About 50 feet from my tent, on a tree trunk at eye level, was a mark. A long, deep slash in the bark, fresh, the wood underneath still light in color. It hadn't been there the day before. I looked around, scanning the trees, the brush, anything that might give me a clue as to who or what had done it. But I was alone. At least I hoped I was. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up by the fire, knife in my lap, my back to my tent, listening. The woods felt different. The usual sounds of crickets and distant owls were gone. The silence was thick, pressing down on me like a weight. Then, just past midnight, the sound came again. Footsteps, slow, steady, approaching. I gripped my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped just outside the firelight. I couldn't see anything beyond the flickering glow of the flames, but I could feel it. Someone was there. Then, just like before, a long, slow exhale. I snapped. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. But I knew better. I wasn't alone. I had two choices: stay and risk whatever was happening getting worse, or pack up and leave right then. My gut screamed at me to go. I threw my gear into my pack, doused the fire, and grabbed my knife. My truck was 2 miles away through the woods, but I didn't care. I started walking, fast, my flashlight bouncing as I moved. Every so often, I'd hear movement behind me, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Not fast, not running, just following. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. When I reached my truck, I threw my pack into the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I barely got the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out onto the dirt road, not looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, in the red glow of my taillights, I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, motionless, watching. I didn't stop until I was miles away. When I finally pulled into a gas station, my hands were still shaking. I sat there for a long time, staring at my reflection in the windshield, trying to process what had happened. I told myself it was just some stranger messing with me. Maybe a hunter, maybe another camper. But deep down, I knew better. Whoever it was, they had been waiting, watching. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. A week alone in the woods. No people, no noise, no distractions. Just me, my tent, my gear, and nature. I had found a spot deep in the national forest, miles from the nearest road. It was perfect. Secluded, quiet, peaceful. I packed my truck with everything I would need. A tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food and water, a small propane stove, a hunting knife, a hatchet, and my rifle. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I always brought a firearm when I went this deep into the woods. You never know what you might run into. Bears, coyotes, or worse, people who don't want to be found. The drive was long, most of it on dirt roads that got rougher the further I went. Eventually, I reached the spot I had marked on my map. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and started the hike to my campsite. It was about 4 miles in, but I had planned for that. I wanted to be far away from everything. The first day was perfect. I set up my tent near a small creek, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple meal. The air was crisp. The forest was alive with birds and rustling leaves. Felt good to be alone. As the sun set, I made a small fire and sat beside it, listening to the sounds of the woods. The crackling of the fire, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful. I went to bed early, tired from the hike. The forest was silent except for the occasional chirp of insects. I fell asleep quickly. That night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was close. A soft rustling, like something moving through the undergrowth. I held my breath, listening. It stopped, probably just a raccoon or a rabbit. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found something strange. Near my campsite, the dirt had been disturbed. It looked like something had been digging, but not an animal. The marks were too deliberate, almost like someone had used their hands. I felt uneasy but brushed it off. Maybe a porcupine or some other animal searching for food. I spent the day exploring, following the creek deeper into the woods. The further I went, the less the forest felt welcoming. The trees grew denser, the air felt heavier. I found an old deer carcass, half buried under leaves. It wasn't fresh, but something had been picking at it. The bones were clean in some places, gnawed in others. It didn't look like the work of a predator. As the sun dipped lower, I turned back toward camp. I walked faster than I had on the way in, my skin prickling. The feeling of being watched settled over me, but I saw nothing. When I reached camp, I checked my gear. Everything was where I left it. I forced myself to relax. It was just my imagination, I told myself. That night, the noises came back. This time, they were closer. Twigs snapping. Footsteps? I sat up in my tent, heart pounding. I grabbed my rifle and waited, listening. The sound stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour before lying back down. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I found more disturbed ground. This time, it was closer to my tent. Small holes, shallow but deliberate, like someone had been poking around. My gut told me to leave, but I ignored it. I had planned this trip for months, and I wasn't about to let my nerves ruin it. I spent the day fishing in the creek, catching enough to cook for dinner. I tried to enjoy it, but the unease wouldn't go away. As the sun set, I set up a larger fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire with my rifle in my lap, staring into the darkness. The noises came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. Then, just as before, they stopped. I called out. Nothing. No response, no movement. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my rifle so hard my fingers ached. At first light, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my gear quickly, shoving everything into my backpack. I didn't bother cooking breakfast. As I started back toward my truck, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. About a mile from my campsite, I found something that made my blood run cold. A pile of rocks, stacked neatly in a way that didn't look natural. Next to it, a single boot print. Not mine. Someone had been out there with me. I moved fast, nearly running through the woods. My rifle was in my hands, safety off. Every sound made my skin crawl. I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack into the bed and climbed in, locking the doors. I started the engine, my hands shaking. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the trees. A shadow, a figure. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back to that forest. I still camp, but never alone. Never that deep in the woods, because I know now out there in the quiet places you're never really alone.